This week, verses 1 through 4. Our translation today comes from the Living Bible. Hear these words of the psalmist. Because the Lord is my shepherd, I have everything I need. He lets me rest in the meadow of grass and leads me beside the quiet streams. He restores my failing health. He helps me do whatever honors him the most. Even when walking through the dark valley of death, I will not be afraid. For you are close beside me, guarding, guiding all the way. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.
A great scholar once said, God demands a whole heart, but cradles a broken one. This is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning, experiencing the tender care of God when your heart is breaking, particularly when your heart is breaking due to loss, due to the death of a loved one. That is, today I'd like to offer some reflections on working through the pain of grief, especially when it seems to be getting the better of you, and how to hopefully keep it from doing so. Today in our study of the 23rd Psalm, we arrive at what is arguably the most famous part of the text outside the opening phrase, the line most familiar, most often quoted, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Now, as we have noted previously in this series, this psalm is basically a litany of all the ways the author has experienced God's care in his or her life. And this particular verse could be said to be referring to God's help in any time of danger or threat, or in times of grave physical illness or hardship, when we're facing our own mortality. But of course, the image most commonly associated with this line is the death of a loved one. And this is the setting in which this text is most often used and to which most people associate it, a funeral. And so this is how I'd like to focus on it this morning. From this very famous text, some reflections on what it has to say to us about those most difficult and most painful times, some thoughts on how God cares for us in times of grief. Thought number one, God journeys with us. The verse, of course, begins, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Notice a couple of the key words, key phrases in this. First, yea, though I walk through. Note the text begins by stating right up front that death is not something that God takes us around, but rather something God takes us through. That it is not something to be avoided, but something that will be confronted. And this is our first issue here. In grief therapy, they're generally understood to be, 5 stages of normal grief, and they are shock, denial, anger, depression, and acceptance. And notice how the first 3 of these focus on the idea of somehow trying to resist or to refuse the loss. You see, this is the first big problem here. The first most common way that we also often short-circuit the healing process of following the death of a loved one is that we try some way to avoid the reality of the loss. And by this I don't mean that we outright deny that there's actually been a loss, a death, although this does occur in some people and it's a true pathological breakdown in the process. Rather, what I mean is something more subtle and more insidious, namely that we openly acknowledge the death. However, we try to resist having it really take hold of us. We try to pretend like it's not a problem for us, that it didn't really happen. It doesn't bother us. No big deal. We're doing fine. And we men, we're particularly prone to this kind of approach to things. Think of it this way. Have you ever noticed how many euphemisms we have for death? We say, passed away, departed, eternal rest, heavenly slumber, kicked the bucket, bought the farm, pushing up the daisies, sleeping with the fishes, taking a dirt nap, right? Why all these sayings? Because they are a means of avoiding the reality of the occurrence, to journey around and not through. Well, let us make no mistake, no matter how hard we may try to pretend, there is no avoiding this process. As one prominent psychologist writes, 3 things are fundamental to an understanding of mourning. First, each loss revives all past losses. Second, each loss, if fully mourned, can be a vehicle for growth and regeneration. And third, each loss launches us on an inescapable course through grief. An inescapable course. In other words, there is no way to avoid this. We can try to pretend like it isn't happening, but that doesn't stop it from happening. If we try to pretend like it isn't going on, all that does is keep us trapped forever at the threshold of the very thing that keeps us trapped. We're trying to avoid, and it leaves us that pain within us, which must come out somewhere, to come out in an appropriate way, or even worse, in a bad way, That thing's got to vent somehow, and if you don't do it, it will do it itself in a wrong way, In effect, the first point here is to be willing to acknowledge, and even more to learn to express the pain that we are experiencing, to speak it, to cry it, to accept it as a reality, to live it out, not hold it in, ignore it, or deny it. As Shakespeare once wrote, "Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak whispers to the o'erfraught heart and bids it break." First lesson here is that grief is something that must be entered into and journeyed through, confronted and expressed. But then from this, notice even more a couple of the other key words in this opening phrase. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me." It's the other side of this opening line, you see. Yes, we are called into grief. It is required that we journey into and through loss, but as the text makes clear, we do not journey alone. God goes with us. And this is the other side of the first major point I'd like to make here. That we are called to, we must journey through grief, not around it, but we do not journey alone. God goes with us. And most especially, God goes with us in other people. In effect, if you're grieving, don't go it alone. Get out. Get out. Even if at times it seems like that's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. Get out and get involved. Get connected to other people. And realize that God is bringing other people to you for this, to help you. This is, one of the key points of our gathering here each week of church. God gives us one another, brings us other people to journey with, to be His presence with us. We need to recognize this and reach out to it. God is doing this for us all the time. True story. A number of years ago, there was a news report in USA Today that told of a couple named Sam and Teresa who boarded TWA Flight 265 in New York to fly to Orlando to see Disney World. Teresa was almost 7 months pregnant, and 30 minutes into the flight, she doubled over in pain and she began bleeding. And flight attendants announced that they needed a doctor, and a Long Island internist volunteered. And Teresa soon gave birth to a boy, but the baby was in trouble. The umbilical cord was wrapped tightly around his neck, and he wasn't breathing. His face was blue. 2 paramedics rushed forward to help, one of whom specialized in infant respiratory procedures. He asked if anyone had a straw, which he wanted to use to suction fluid out of the baby's lungs. The plane didn't stock straws, but a flight attendant remembered having a straw left over from a juice box that she had happened to bring on board. The paramedic inserted the straw into the baby's lungs as the internist administered CPR. The internist then asked for something he could use to tie off the umbilical cord, and a passenger took off one of his shoelaces and handed it to him. 4 minutes of terror passed. And then the baby whimpered, and soon the crew was able to joyfully announce that it was a boy, and everybody on board, they cheered and they applauded. The parents gave the now healthy little boy the name Matthew, which means God sent, and said to Father, "The people on board that plane were all God sends. When we are in trouble, God sends us people so that we won't travel alone, so that He can be with us and save us. All we have to do is look around." All we have to do is look around. Noted preacher writes, "A few winters ago, heavy snows hit North Carolina. Following a wet 6-inch snowfall, it was interesting to see the effect along Interstate 40. Next to the highway stood several large groves of tall, young pine trees. The branches were bowed down with heavy snow, so low that the branches from one tree were often leaning against the trunk or branches of another. Where trees stood alone, however, the effect of the snow was different. The branches had become heavier, but without the other trees to lean against, the branches snapped. They lay on the ground, dark and alone in the cold snow. When the storms of life hit, we need to stand close to our fellow Christians. The closer we stand, the more we will be able to hold up." When you're in trouble, particularly when you're facing the greatest loss, the greatest threat of loss, face your grief, express it, and don't try to go it alone. Let God travel with you. Thought number 1 to remember in times of grief, God journeys with us. Thought number 2 then, God fights for us. returning to the text after this opening statement of God traveling with us into and through times of loss, the author then adds an extra little comment on how he has specifically experienced this, and he says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." The psalmist mentions how he has experienced God's comfort in times of pain, and the comfort taking the form of two of the most basic tools of the shepherd. And I'd like to look at these in turn. And the first is the rod. In the shepherd's arsenal, the rod is a kind of a short, heavy stick that's used for a variety of purposes in the care of the sheep. For example, it's used to regularly kind of dig open the sheep's wool to inspect the health of the animal's skin. But primarily, the rod is used as a weapon. It's used as a club to defend against predators. And the rod is a weapon of defense against enemies. And this, I believe, is the next thing the author wants us to know, that in times of grief, God is armed. God is armed to fight for us, to defend us. This presumably because in such times we are in tremendous danger of attack. The second great obstacle in grief that we need to be aware of. When we travel through the valley of the shadow of death, we are in great danger of attack, predators, enemies from within and without. Fears, self-destructive behaviors, those thoughts late at night. And most especially dangerous of all, guilt. Simply put, in all my years of pastoral ministry, I have never done a funeral in which in some way or another guilt or shame was not expressed about something regarding the deceased. It seems to be an absolute necessary, unavoidable component of the procedure. The loss and the finality dredges up everything that was done wrong that can no longer be undone, Sometimes it's something said that shouldn't have been said. Sometimes it's something that should have been said but failed to be said. Sometimes it's something done that we wished we hadn't done. Sometimes it's something we failed to do that we wish we had done. Sometimes, truth be told, it's simply that we really couldn't stand the person, right? But now that they're gone, it seems wrong to have ever thought ill of them. It's kind of like the old joke about the funeral service. It was being held for a rather unsavory character, a rotten husband, terrible father, horrible individual, a man who had never been near a place of worship in his life. The services were being conducted by a minister who had never met the man, but kind of getting carried away by the occasion, he started pouring on praise for the departed. Right? After about 10 minutes of hearing the late lamented described as the ideal husband, father, and boss, the widow nudged her son and whispered, "Go up there and make sure it's Papa in that box." Sometimes, let's be honest. The person who died, you can say anything you want, the person who died, we're happy to see him go, right? But you see now, even this can fill us with shame that we could be so hateful, Which leads us into, sometimes worst of all, the issue is that person whom you loved so deeply, who suffered so greatly, and you had to take care of them. Maybe over a month, maybe years, And one night when you were particularly exhausted from caring for them, as you lay there in bed, staring up at the ceiling, you thought, if only for a moment, you thought, I wish they would drop dead, And you thought this not only for them, because you couldn't stand to see them suffer anymore, but far more for yourself, because you had it. You'd had it with caring for them, right? But now they're gone, and as far as you can tell, you're a horrible person, right? You're a terrible person for ever wishing them dead. In grief, we invariably become consumed with guilt over something about the deceased, and thus convince ourselves that somehow we don't particularly deserve to get over our pain, that it's our rightful punishment for our evil. This thought so often consumes our hearts and blocks us in the healing process of grief. God's answer? Well, as the psalmist reminds us, God fights for us. Thy rod, it comforts me. That is, God is saying, don't let that predator have the last word in your life. Look to your defender. Essentially, what we beat ourselves up over so often in grief is normal and natural. And even better, God understands and forgives it all. First is normal, in that everyone makes mistakes. And if you're in some horrible situation taking care of somebody that endlessly, there'd be something wrong with you if you didn't want out of it. But secondly, and even more importantly, God understands all this, whatever it is, and he forgives it all, That this is the whole point of Christ Jesus, that God knows all our pain and struggles, our humanity, and he takes it all from us to the cross. In the image of the rod, God is saying, Center yourself in my forgiveness and refuse anything or anybody that says otherwise. Know that I fight for you. Don't let your enemy have the last word with you. Let your defender. Preacher Bill Hybels writes, a friend of mine had a very sickly, brain-damaged daughter. Sometimes the sadness and struggle she felt over her daughter's condition would overwhelm her. She wrote me this letter about her struggles, and she gave me permission to quote from it. And she writes, I could hardly bear it sometimes. My most recent wave of grief came just before my daughter's 7th birthday. As the day approached, I found myself brooding over all the things that she would never be able to do. Even more, I found myself brooding over all the hardship and constant work of her care, all that it had cost me and cost our family. Such thoughts had been increasingly overtaking me. I felt like such a horrible person. Right at that moment, however, in walked my daughter wearing her WWJD t-shirt. What would Jesus do? I looked at the letters, and as I sat there on the bed feeling so absolutely horrible about myself, I thought, what would Jesus do? And suddenly I knew. What would Jesus do? Well, he would do what he had done for so many others. He would sit down next to me and hug me and say, all is forgiven. Live. I reached out and hugged my daughter, really hugged her for the first time in many months. We had many more hugs in the years that followed, and when my daughter died 3 years later, whenever the thoughts would come late at night, I would just remember her shirt and those letters, WWJD. When the attacks come, and trust me, they will, late at night, sudden, unaware, hurtful, destructive thoughts, think instead of the love of Jesus Christ. Thought number 2 to remember in times of grief, God fights for us. And then finally, thought number 3, God urges us on. Returning one final time to the equipment, the shepherd uses in his care of the flock. The other way the psalmist says, his experience, his care and presence in loss is through the shepherd's staff. And the shepherd's staff is, of course, it's the most uniquely recognizable piece of shepherding equipment. It's the long stick with the hook on the end. And once again, as with the rod, it serves a variety of functions. It is used as a walking stick for the shepherd. The long part of the staff is used to free an animal that has become stuck, say, like in a thorn bush or something. The hook is actually used to lift out sheep that have fallen and gotten stuck into ditches or holes. And the actual leading of the sheep is done to the shepherd applying pressure with the staff against the shoulder of the lead animal. In all of this, note what the common theme here is. The common theme is movement. It's keeping the flock moving. The staff represents movement, and this is the final key piece in God's care for us in times of grief, to keep us moving, to urge us on. Basically, the final major reason why many people wind up becoming overcome by grief is that they stall out in it in some way. They fail to keep moving on with life. And this has various nuances. For some, it stems from just a basic unwillingness to change in any way. That is, whenever you experience a loss, a void is created in your life. The role and function that person provided for you is now gone, right? You have this gap. As one author reflects, following the death of his young wife. How could things go on when the world had come to an end? How could I go on in this void? How could one person, not very big, leave an emptiness that was a galaxy wide? See, that's what grief is. It's one person, not very big, leaving an emptiness in us that's a galaxy wide. To continue on, this void has got to get filled. And the way this void is filled is by everything else in your life having to change, to shift and adjust, to fill the gap. Obviously, if you will not allow such change, you're in serious trouble. It's kind of like the old saying goes, blessed are the flexible, for they do not get bent out of shape. A noted preacher writes, grief is a man walking daily to a nearby cemetery to stand quietly and alone for a few minutes before going about the task of his day. He knows that this is now part of his daily work. Grief is a woman learning to make a whole meal for just one after years of eating with another. Grief is teaching yourself to go to bed without saying goodnight to that one who died. Grief is a whole cluster of apprehensions, uncertainties, and adjustments to a new reality. It's a whole cluster of adjustments to a new reality. The way many people stall out in grief is through an unwillingness to adjust in any way. Things must be forever as they were. Unfortunately, they're not, you know? So the person becomes trapped. The shepherd staff reminds us that we must be open to change. And in that even more, the shepherd staff thus reminds us that we must ultimately let go and move on. That is, in the end, the stalling out in grief most commonly takes the form of simply being afraid to let go. Basically, in grief, we're finally caught in a great quandary, a tremendous quandary, namely, we want to get over and be rid of the great pain that we are feeling. But we also don't want to lose hold of the loved one that we've just lost. In effect, we want to let go, but we don't want to let go. Now, you'd think the pain would drive us to let go, but invariably it doesn't. For often we cling. We grab on tight, and we refuse to let go of that person, the memories, the moments, sometimes even all of their stuff, you know? And why? Because far more important to us than the pain is, deep down inside we are afraid that if we let go for even a moment, it will all slip from their grasp. They'll be gone. That person, the memories, the moments. That if we stop grieving, we'll stop loving, and thus we'll lose the love we once had. And this is the worst possible thing imaginable. So we grab on tight, and we hurt. Yet ironically, in our anguish, what we fail to realize that this is happening completely backwards, that the opposite of what we're feeling is actually what's true. Think of it this way. The home of Paul Laurence Dunbar, is a noted poet, is open to the public in Dayton, Ohio. And when Dunbar died, his mother left his room exactly as it was on the day of his death. At the desk of this brilliant man was his final poem, handwritten on a pad. But after his mother died, her friends discovered that Dunbar's last poem had been lost forever because his mother had made his room into a shrine and not moved anything, and the sun having bleached the ink on which the poem was written until it is now invisible. The poem is gone. In trying so hard to hold on, she lost more than she knew. Such it is with us any time of loss. If we stay in mourning, we lose so much of life. And this is our final lesson here. That we finally so often short-circuit the healing process by trying too hard to hold on. We hold on rather than rightly let go. Not that this means that to properly grieve we have to purge all memories and all mementos of the deceased. Of course not. It simply means being more about letting go, giving away, offering our love. It's simply remembering that being loving will overcome grief and best hold the memory of the loved one. Because the nature of true love is that it cannot be held. It only exists when it's given away. I mean, remember the example of Jesus' own life. It was in giving away his love that he most held on to it. To overcome grief, quit trying so hard to hold on, and instead let God call you out into the world to express your love again. That great ability to love you obviously have, or else you wouldn't know grief. A love that now causes you hurt but can also heal you. As Tolstoy said, only people who are capable of loving strongly can also suffer great sorrow. But the same necessity of loving serves to counteract their grief and can heal them. To put it another way, the image of the shepherd's staff finally reminds us of God's prompting us to let go and move on. This not in the sense of losing hold or losing sight, but in the sense of placing this gift, this gift in our lives in a new place and being then driven by the very nature of that gift back onto life, the life it gave to us. As grief therapists note, the final step in healthy grieving is adapting to your new situation, specifically emotionally relocating the deceased and moving on. Not that they're gone forever, lost, they're only relocated in our hearts. And we Christians, of course, we have a unique advantage of this. For through Jesus Christ, death is not the end. All who die have a new home in him. Notice how our text today began. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The person of faith in Jesus Christ only ever truly faces the shadow of death, not death itself. In effect, grief is never done. You don't ever get over it. You always carry it with you, but you travel on with it in its place, finding life again, keeping that love forever by striving to offer that love, to let go of it to the world, and not to hold it close. Author Melody McCarty tells the following true story. Hi, Mommy. What are you doing? Asked Susie. I'm making a casserole for Mrs. Smith next door, said her mother. Why? Asked Susie, who was only 6 years old. Well, remember how you felt when your fish Goldie died? It's something like that, said her mother. Mrs. Smith is very sad because she lost her daughter and she has a broken heart. We need to take care of her for a little while. You see, Susie, when someone is very, very sad, they have trouble doing little things like making dinner or other chores. Because Mrs. Smith is our neighbor, we need to do some things to help her. Mrs. Smith won't ever be able to talk to her daughter or hug her or do all those wonderful things that mommies and daughters do together. You're a very smart girl, Susie. Maybe you'll think of some way to help take care of Mrs. Smith. Knowing something of what it felt like, Susie thought seriously about this challenge and how she could do her part in caring for Mrs. Smith. A few moments later, Susie ran next door and knocked on Mrs. Smith's door. After a few minutes, Mrs. Smith answered. Susie noticed that Mrs. Smith didn't have that familiar musical quality about her voice when she greeted someone. Mrs. Smith also looked as though she might have been crying because her eyes were watery and swollen. "What can I do for you?" asked Mrs. Smith. Susie said, "My mommy says that you lost your daughter and you're very, very sad with a broken heart. I know." And Susie then held out her hand shyly, and in it was a single Band-Aid. "This is for your broken heart," she said. Mrs. Smith gasped, choking back tears. She then knelt down and she hugged Susie, and through her tears she said, "Thank you so much, Susie. This will help a lot." Mrs. Smith accepted Susie's act of kindness and took it one step further. She purchased a small key ring with a plexiglass picture frame, the ones designed to carry keys and proudly display a family portrait at the same time. Mrs. Smith placed Susie's Band-Aid in the frame to remind herself to heal a little every time she sees it. And even better, she bought herself a box of Band-Aids and carries it with her always, offering a Band-Aid and the healing story of Susie to anyone she meets that is struggling with grief. Many years have now passed, and she has found tremendous joy in this simple ministry. It has been said, "Earth hath no sorrow that heaven cannot heal." Do you today suffer from the pain of loss? Remember, no matter how bad the pain is, God can bring you through it. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." God's care for us in times of grief. God journeys with us, God fights for us, and God urges us on to life. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 133, "Leaning on the Everlasting Arms." Would you please stand?